All right, in this video we are going to talk about buttons. It's really kind of the gas pedal in our metaphor of the animate engine. Okay, so if you didn't download that libraries folder from the Mat server, you should do that now. I talked about that in a couple of videos ago. So anyway, you'll find that in the one student download folder, in the Mat 120 folder, and you'll find libraries in two places. You should have downloaded both of these folders anyways, but in case you didn't, download this folder and download that folder. Okay? And in these both of these folders, you'll find a folder called libraries. Okay? This is very important because this is where all the buttons are. All right, so after you've downloaded that, you will open up that buttons FLA project folder, project itself, and then you'll see this. Don't worry about it, ignore it, just say okay. Now when this thing opens, this may not look like this. Okay, what it might look like is something like this. Okay, and we don't really want that. What we want it to do is, if it doesn't look like what I just showed you, go to Preferences, Expert Preferences. Okay? Now, this allows us to see the timeline and all the information, because what we're going to see when we talk about buttons is that they're kind of their own little project in and of themselves. And that's something Animate does a lot, is that you can have a project inside of a project inside of a project. It can get very complicated. And so buttons are kind of like that. So I'm going to just click a button at random and I'm going to open it up. And what we'll see here is a whole different timeline. I'm going to zoom out on that a little bit so you can sort of see what's going on. And what happens here is that you'll see that instead of the normal timeline for the buttons, it looks different. Basically what you see is you have an up keyframe, you have an over keyframe, you have a down keyframe, and you have a hit keyframe. Each one of these keyframes is a part of the button, and each part has its own layers that are basically like what we just saw. You can have a lot of different things in each layer. And when we look at this button in the up state, this is what it looks like, right? And you'll see that it's got a center ring, it has a center border, it has a gradient circle, which is the little gradient thing going on in there. It has an outer circle and an outer border. Okay, so those are all the parts of the particular of the button. In the over state, which is what it looks like when the mouse rolls over it, you'll see that it's got just that little ring is different. And so you see that keyframe right there. It's the only thing that's different. The down state is what it looks like when you click on it. And that's, again, a couple of different things. That ring changes, and that thing changes. So from the up state to the hit state, to the down state, which is when the button's on it, those are all different graphics. So it's not important to you right now. All we really want to do is make the button work, and this is the key, the hit state. Now the hit state is one of the most important things about a button. Without a hit state, it won't work, period. And the hit state can be anything. Usually the hit state is simply the largest shape of the object. In this case, it's a round circle. And so basically what will happen is that when the mouse comes over the button, that hit state hears or sees the cursor coming over it, and then it starts to respond. So what will happen is that when you roll over it, it'll do that. When you click on it, it'll do that. But it won't do anything without that. Okay, so some of these buttons have trouble. I'm not sure who was doing the QC on it, but there are some issues. One of them, for example, is that everything is locked, so we can't change anything. Well, we can, But you have to be aware that if you select a button and suddenly you can't move anything or change anything, it's because it's locked. So that little lock button right there locks all the layers. This allows you to not muck things up. But if you want to, say, for example, change the text, the enter right there, we won't be able to do that unless we unlock it. So what you want to do here is you want to find the buttons that you want to use and you want to copy those. So at the moment I'm editing right now, so I'm going to just go back. Notice here where it says, this is my little kind of my breadcrumb, if you will. And so what will happen here is that I can click on scene 1, and then this brings me back to the buttons. If I double click on a button, I'm now editing it, and that's where I'm at. And another way of getting out of that edit is simply double click on the background. Okay, so say I want to use, what do I want to use all these? Okay, so everything that you see is part of the project, so even numbers and stuff like that, these are all, part of the project itself. So what we want to do is we want to select, say, I don't know, 3 buttons. How about 4? Okay, and I'm going to just grab those 4 buttons, and those are going to be the buttons that I'm going to use for my project. So I'm going to copy those, Command-C, and I'm going to go back to my project over here, and I'm going to go into my library. See that up here? This is Properties, Library. Okay, I'm going to select it, and then I'm going to just Command-V, paste, and then I get a little folder with my buttons in it. Okay, and there's all my buttons. Okay, the blue one, the green one, the orange one, and the red one. Okay, now one of the things we haven't done yet, and this is really important, is we need to save. Okay, so we're going to go File, Save As, and then I'm going to save this into my my Animate folder. And so that's in my project folder, in my 120 folder. Okay, remember. All right, so you go navigate back to your project folder, and I'm going to call this demo-1. Okay, and then I'm going to save that. And now you want to save often. This program autosaves, and so this is something that while I'm talking about it, I might as well mention it. Up in the preferences, in the edit preferences, you'll see an autosave or auto recovery. You can either turn that off, which I don't recommend unless you're really good about saving regularly, but you can also change the time. And the default is 10 minutes, but that can be a little bit short, especially if you're working on a computer that has limited RAM and limited horsepower like laptops and so on. The autosave can kick in and really take a long time to autosave while you're trying to get something done. So you might want to take that number and make it a little bit higher. Play around with it. That's just one of those things you might want to do. Okay, so I'm going to say okay to that. And so now we want to add some buttons. So remember we have, we didn't add a button layer. We didn't add a button layer. All right, let's do that. Let's add a button layer. We'll call that buttons. That was stupid. And buttons will go right up on top. And we didn't add some we need to add some keyframes. So F6 to add the keyframe, F6, 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 and F6. Okay, so that will add some keyframes to our project. All right, so now we have a layer for buttons. Boy, that was kind of a silly mistake, wasn't it? All right, so now that we have a layer for buttons, we can add some buttons to our project. So on the main menu, if we go back to our XD project, you will see our main menu has 3 buttons on it, and they each need to go to one of the 3 pages. And remember, in the previous video, I said that the exception to the one object, one frame layer rule is buttons. So I'm going to grab the blue button and I'm going to drag it out onto the stage and put it more or less where my other buttons. Fuck. Losing it here. All right, so let's add some buttons to our project. Okay, so we have our button layer, and we are on the main menu. And so remember, we want to select the keyframe and the layer of where we want to make this happen. Remember that you can have all the buttons you want on one layer. And so you'll see in the library, which is where we pasted our buttons, is that you have the button, and this is the actual button, okay, not the blue glow. Okay, that's the actual button that you want to use, okay? There's also a little play button right here. Shows you what it looks like when the animation plays. And so we have, if we go back to our XD project, we see that we have 3 buttons on our main menu. And so we go back to animate, and we will add the blue button. And then we will add the green button. And then we will add the orange button. Okay, so now they're kind of small, and so we can fix that. There's a couple of things that we can do. So the first thing we want to do is we want to select them all, and this is typical of any Adobe program. Just drag a marquee around the 3 buttons. And you've got some cool tools here to make this aligned. So we can align them, say, to the left, and we can distribute them so that they're evenly distributed. And then we'll close that window up, and then we can grab our transform tool, and then holding the shift key down, we can then grow all the buttons together at once. And if we decide that it's too close or too far, we can scoot that up, select them all again, and then distribute to make them equal. And then we'll just scoot them down, and then there's our 3 buttons. Okay, so now notice they say enter. It's like, well, that's kind of lame, right? We don't really want it to say enter. We want it to say something like page 1. So here's where we have to start editing the buttons. If you double click on it, if you recall, let's see, what am I doing here? It's kind of annoying that that was are so tall. Anyway, we see the text layer, which will be locked by default, and then all the other buttons, all the other layers. We don't need these, so we'll leave them alone. The only thing we want to do is unlock the text. And so then we can select the text, and notice we can't select anything else because it's locked, which is a good thing because it's easy to muck these things up. So double clicking on it and then highlighting all the text in it will allow us to do a variety of things. So the first thing we might want to do is go back to properties right there, and we might want to make it a different typeface. So, you know, for text on buttons, I like things that are kind of bold. I think they work a little bit better than light style typefaces. So I'm going to kind of go to one of my standard impact, right? I'm going to make it impact, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Wait, hold on a second. Wrong. There it is, size. Whoa. And you'll notice that it might muck up, right? So we might want to make the box a little bit bigger, and then make our text a little bit bigger. And then something like that. Okay, and the other thing, let's go back to the pointer tool for a moment. We can then put it where we want it to. We can use our arrow keys to put it in the right spot. The one thing we might want to do though is in the properties menu, it says bitmap. That's always the default for buttons. And bitmap, if we zoom in on that, looks kind of crappy. And so what we want to do is we want to select that, and we want to go anti-alias for readability. And then suddenly that looks a whole lot better. And even now I can even make it a little bit bigger, just to kind of make it look kind of cool. All right. Now, obviously, we don't want it to say enter. We want it to say page 1, right? Page 1. And so if indeed I made it too large, you can always just grab that text box and move it, okay? Make it a little bit different size. If it's a little too large, in this case, maybe it is now, I want to drop that back just a shade, just so that it doesn't go over the borders. You know, these are aesthetic calls, okay? So once we're done editing, simply double click on the background and you're back out onto the normal situation. So what we might want to do that to the other 3 buttons, but we'll just deal with the code for now. Okay, so now this page 1 button wants to go to page 1, okay? And so in this situation then, what we'll do is we will also create a back button, because once we get here we need to get back somehow, right? So I'm going to go back to my library. I'm going to grab that red button and I'm going to drag that over here someplace, and we'll make it a little bit bigger. So it looks, holding the shift key down will constrain it. I'm not going to edit it. I showed you how to do that already. Because what it says doesn't mean anything. You know, you could have a picture be a button, a piece of text could be a button, you know, an invisible spot can be a button, anything can be a button. Okay, so now we have our page 1, and we have our main menu and we have our page 1. Okay, so I'm going to scoot that down a little bit. So what we want to do now is we want to code. Okay, so I'm going to go back to properties. I'm going to go back to our our main menu. I'm going to select the button, and then I'm going to go into my code snippets, and in action script, flip that down. Again, timeline animation. What we want to do is we want to click the button and go someplace, right? So we can see we have some options here. We have the stop, which we used. Click and go to a frame and stop. Go to a frame and play. Go to next frame previous. These are good for slideshows and so on, but for now let's just get the basic navigation going. So we're going to say go to the frame and stop. Okay, so that's the code that we want to use. You double click on that, go to the frame and stop. Double click on it, go to the frame and stop. See what it says? I need to name it an instance. This is important. The Animate likes names. It likes it to have a name so it knows what it's talking about or who it's talking to. You'll see that right up in here in the instance name. So we'll just call this page 1 but. Page 1 but. And as you get more and more things in your library, having names for them is often helpful. Okay, so that's what we'll call that. We'll call this one page 2 but, and we'll call this one page 3 but, because we got to code all these, right? Page 3 but. Okay, so everybody's got a name. We might as well name this guy while we're at it. He's our back butt. Okay, so now we have the names of all the buttons so that when we start coding it, we don't get that error every single time. All right, so we are now on our main menu page. We have our page 1 button selected. We go to our code snippets, and we say go to frame and stop. And so now what happens here is that we get a piece of code. Come on, there it is right there. All right, and this is actually a kind of a big window. There it is. All right, and the instructions, which don't wrap, wish they did. We'll see right now we already have on that frame the stop action that we added before. And so now we have the new code that starts here. This gray between the hash and the star, this is called comment. All right. It's not code, but it tells you what to do with the code. So that's pretty handy when it comes to snippets. So what it's asking us to do, first it tells us what the button does. Then it says how to use it, instructions. Replace the number 5 right there, in the code below with the frame number you would like the playback head to go to. Okay, so if we zoom in on this, we're here. That button is going to go to frame 10 right there. Okay, so it's important to know that it's a number, a frame number, not necessarily the label that we put on it. Okay, so in this case here, we want that button to go to frame 10. So we replace that 5 with the 10, and then we're done. And then we're done. Okay, I'm going to scoot that back into here for a moment. All right. And then on page 1, we have this. And this button has to return us to the main menu, right? So now this one is going to say, come on, there we go. This is going to go back to frame 1. Okay, so here, remember when you're doing code, the code on any given frame is going to be wherever you click. Okay, see how that works on frame 1? This is the code I just added. I'm on frame 10, and I need to go back to frame 1. Here's the code I just added for the page 1, the back button. So this has to go back to frame 1. Okay? So let's see if this works. All right. So we have a button on page 1 to go to page 1, and we have a back button that goes back. Okay? So let's see if this works. We do that by testing the movie. The easiest way to test the movie is with a keyboard command, but if you insist, you can go to Control, Test Movie. Okay? Alternatively, the easiest thing to do is hit the Command Return, and that will test the movie automatically. So notice our stop command has worked, right? Because we go to our very first frame, that very first code we put on there was stop. So here it is, it stopped. Notice the little button, page 1. It goes to page 1. Okay, and it stopped, right? The code says stop. When it got there, it stops. Okay, so now here's our back button. Click on that, and it goes back to the main menu. So that's essentially how this all works. If I clicked on page 2, this would go to the page 2. We'd have a back button, and it would come back to here. Okay, so when you're done testing, just close the window. And the other cool thing is that you can take a button like this, and you can double click on it to edit it, and we'll unlock it, because remember the text layer is locked. We'll double click on the text, zoom in on it. Come on, there we go. And we'll just call this back. Notice how nasty the anti-aliasing looks. So let's copy that. Let's go back and added some impact onto there. And let's see, impact. Let's go to impact. There it is right there. Notice how nasty it looks, but if I take that and I say anti-alias for readability, it looks a whole lot nicer. I can make it bigger. And then I'm done. I can escape that. Go back to my V key so I can maybe center it up a little bit. And that's all good. So now once I'm done with editing that, I can double click. And I'm zoomed out. So let me zoom back in here. Command 0, Command 1, Command 0. There we go. All right. So that doesn't change our functionality at all. But remember our paste in place with our titles? We can do the same thing with buttons. We can copy that button. We can go to page 2, right click, paste in place. The back button's there. Page 3, paste in place. Oops, sorry. Paste in place. Paste in place. And paste in place. We'll have to add new code to each one of those, but at least the buttons are now exactly all in the right same place and everything looks cool. So if I'm back on page 1 and I want to go to page 2, I already have a back button there, okay? And then we'll just have to code those the same way. All right? So that is the essence of buttons in Adobe Animate.